Sodom and Gomorrah, the legendary cities of sin, destroyed by God in a hail of fire and brimstone. One of the most terrifying and apocalyptic chapters of the Bible. For many, the so-called cities of the plain never existed. The story is mere fiction.
Sodom and Gomorrah fits into, I would say, the legendary aspect, if not mythological.
But for archaeologist and explorer Dr. Stephen Collins, the famous Bible story has its roots in reality. It's based on a very real catastrophic event that occurred in the ancient Near East over 3,000 years ago.
That civilization is snuffed out, and so we have an event that would have scared people to death.
This is a story about ancient skeletons from the Holy Land and the true meaning of the Bible's fire and brimstone.
An equivalent energy to a very large nuclear weapon, almost the largest nuclear weapon that was ever tested.
Collins is convinced he's found the ancient ruins of an unearthly cataclysm. Are they the legendary cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? As a child, growing up in a Christian home, Stephen Collins is no stranger to the stories in the book of Genesis. He attends a church in New Mexico, where his father is a deacon and Sunday school teacher. But his first port of call isn't the Bible. From an early age, Collins is an avid student of Darwinism and the theory of evolution.
As a young child, I didn't pay any more attention to the Bible than most kids, so I just sort of ignored it. Early on in grade school, I was really enamored with evolution of the human race. So I was very taken with all of that, and I studied it.
By the time he finishes college, Collins decides to major in anthropology and linguistics. But his studies soon collide with his homegrown faith.
I was being challenged. My faith was always being challenged from outside, particularly studying anthropology in college.
But Collins is convinced science and the Bible can coexist. And the mission to unite the two would spark a quest for answers on the truth of the Bible.
So that really forced me to go to the text and start really thinking seriously about how the biblical texts are to be understood. Are they mythical? Are they symbolic? Are they legendary in some way? Or are they factual?
Collins's quest would take him to the heart of one of the most terrifying and apocalyptic events in the Bible. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible tells of 5 cities of the plain, each ruled by their own king and located in a fertile area south of the land of Canaan. The most infamous of these cities is Sodom, a cauldron of sin and vice.
The evil things that they are doing motivates this deity, Yahweh, to act in a way to try and eradicate that evil.
For their wickedness, God unleashes his wrath upon Sodom and its satellite cities. Fire rains down from the sky, destroying every living thing in a blazing inferno. Entire populations are wiped off the face of the planet in an instant. Only Abraham's nephew Lot and his family escape the chaos and flee to safety. Angels warn them not to look back. But Lot's wife ignores their advice and is turned into a pillar of salt. It's an incredible story. So incredible that for many Sodom and Gomorrah is no more than a morality tale.
The Bible writers obviously were interested in a story which basically said, look, if you do the wrong thing, you're going to get into trouble.
But for some, the legend is based on a real place. Outside the Bible, the only lead comes from ancient Rome. Strabo, a Roman geographer writing in the 1st century AD, places Sodom and the cities of the plain on the shore of the Dead Sea. Collins learns that in 1973, a search in the southwest region of the Dead Sea unearths evidence of ancient settlements. Excavations reveal a cluster of 5 sites that seem to match the biblical description of the 5 cities of the plain. All 5 cities were destroyed in the Bronze Age, around 2300 BC. That's the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, when most scholars suppose Abraham may have lived. But even more extraordinary is that they were all destroyed by a cataclysmic fire. The largest of the 5 cities are Barbedra and Gomorrah. For many enthusiasts, they become the most likely contenders for the legendary cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. By 1996, Collins is an expert in theology, archaeology, and ancient scripture, and he supports Barbedra and Gomorrah as Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, he travels to the Holy Land to shout it from the rooftops.
And I didn't see any reason not to accept Barbedra and Gomorrah as Sodom and Gomorrah. It seemed to work, seemed to fit. I did a lot of tours, took a lot of people to Barbedra and Gomorrah.
But suddenly, all that was to change. In his hotel room one night, Collins is troubled by a discrepancy between the geography in the Bible and in modern archaeology. The Bible has Abraham and his nephew Lot in the north of the Jordan Valley, somewhere between Bethel and Ai. From there, they can clearly see the plain of Jordan. That would put Sodom and Gomorrah 20 miles away, at most. But Collins knows that mainstream thinking has Sodom at the very southern tip of the Dead Sea, at least 50 miles away. Abraham and Lot couldn't have seen that far, even with binoculars.
From the area of Bethel and Ai, you could just barely see the north end of the Dead Sea. And I thought, I don't see anything in there that would locate Sodom and Gomorrah toward the south into the Dead Sea.
Collins realizes that the archaeologists are all digging in the wrong place.
Because now I had a real serious problem, because I like to take people to authentic sites. And now I had a geographical conundrum on my hands.
Collins realizes the key to locating Sodom and Gomorrah lies in finding the correct location for the plain of Jordan.
The book of Genesis gives us a little bit of information about this plain of Jordan and the cities of the plain, but not much. The story of the destruction of Sodom is not told to us in a way that is intended to give us the sort of material we would need to go and find it.
However, Collins finds a telling clue to the plain of Jordan in the Bible itself. In the original Hebrew, the word for plain is kikar, a word that has a very specific meaning.
If you read the English text, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities were located in the plain of Jordan. But in the Hebrew, the word for plain is actually a very strange and an unusual word. It is the word kikar.
In the Hebrew Bible, kikar means round.
So it's a kikar. And in Egyptian, in ancient Akkadian, Ugaritic, the word appears many, many times.
But in Genesis, this is the only word that's used of locating Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's describing a circular, flat area.
Even in modern Hebrew, a roundabout is called a kikar. So the idea is of a circle.
In other words, the area looks like a tortilla. It's circular.
There's only one area that matches a flat circular plain and has a river running through its middle. It's an area north of the Dead Sea. Somewhere in this plain could be the lost city of Sodom and the truth behind its destruction. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 2002. It is 6 years since Collins realized that Sodom cannot be in the Dead Sea region. His views run against the archaeological establishment. But the mystery of Sodom's true location continues to haunt Collins. So he decides to continue with his unfashionable quest. He looks for Sodom on a good, old-fashioned map.
Scholars are always arguing about whether or not those stories are fact or fiction, or half and half. But they never argue about the legitimacy, the accuracy of the geography described in those stories. You can take most detailed ancient Near Eastern stories and put them on maps. You can map the movements of the people.
In the early Byzantine church of St. George at Madaba, Jordan, Collins finds the oldest surviving original map of famous biblical places.
The Madaba map locates biblical sites. So these are Byzantine, they are Christians who made this mosaic on the floor of a Christian church, locating where they thought biblical sites were.
The map dates to the 6th century AD. It shows many sites that were previously unknown to scholars, but have now been verified by archaeologists. The map includes Zoar, one of the 5 cities of the plain, where, according to the Bible, Lot escapes with his family. Collins hopes the Madaba map might mention Sodom. It doesn't. But it does feature something that intrigues the archaeologist.
There are 2 city depictions with palm trees north of the Dead Sea, but the captions are missing. They're not named.
Unfortunately, the tiles have been damaged and lost to history.
If we had those tiles, they might say Sodom and Gomorrah. We just, we don't know.
But Collins is not so hesitant. The tiles are in the right place, in the circular plain north of the Dead Sea. His hunch is that those tiles once marked the spot.
It's pretty obvious to anybody who really sits and looks at it for very long. The Sodom and Gomorrah are on the map. They're those two cities northeast of the Dead Sea. Well, what else would they be? There's no other biblical cities in that location.
Dr. Collins decides he wants to settle the matter once and for all. With his wife, Danette, and 2 friends, he books a trip to Jordan in search of the legendary cities of sin.
Once I set upon the research in 2001, it became apparent that we had to get on the ground. It wasn't enough to simply analyze the biblical text. We had to test the hypothesis in the real world.
It wouldn't be an easy journey. Collins potentially faced ridicule from his peers, and his quest could turn out to be a blind alley that would cost him everything.
Most of the money is coming out of your own pocket. So you basically, chew through your entire retirement.
When he arrives in Amman, Jordan, Collins heads straight to the American Center of Oriental Research. Its library houses one of the most comprehensive collections of books and rare maps of the region.
We needed survey reports, excavation reports, anything from that area, because it was obviously not published, or if it had been published anywhere, it wasn't being picked up by the mainstream archaeological community.
The 4 of us were just scouring the shelves for everything that we could find that might lend some evidence or clues to what we were looking for to help us aid in our investigation.
Soon the team discovers a lead in the pages of a book called The Antiquities of the Jordan Rift Valley. Written in 1988 by a journalist called Rami Khoury. The self-published book contains a rare map featuring the ruins of numerous ancient cities in the Kikar, or circular plain. One of these dots might be the lost city of Sodom.
We had come with a blank slate. We didn't have any confirmed cities, towns, villages sitting on the eastern Kikar where the cities of the plain should be. Once we started looking at that, all of a sudden we had too many sites. We went from nothing to at least 14 major archaeological sites in that area. Now we had a process of elimination to undergo.
We set out to explore all those different locations, one by one.
We visited every single one. We slavishly went from site to site to site to site.
We went down a lot of little dirt roads, across wadis, into back villages.
Got a feel for the landscapes. And in the process, we did some elimination.
We had our face to the ground looking for artifacts and hoping that our eye would happen to focus on just the right thing at the right time.
From 1967 on, and even earlier, that area was military. There were military emplacements, and I didn't think anything about it. But later, we found out about the landmines. So I went, phew.
By process of elimination, the archaeologist begins whittling down the list. The first and most basic factor is size. Sodom is the only city of the plain to be mentioned by itself. So out of the 5 cities, it had to be the biggest.
Some seemed to be too small, too insignificant, and so we eliminated it.
Other sites didn't fit the same time frame Collins is looking for. By the end of the week, 2 prime suspects for the city of Sodom remain: the towels or mounds of Nimrin and El Hammam. Tal El Hammam is far and away the best candidate.
Tal Hammam is not just the largest city in the Bronze Age in the southern Jordan Valley, but it's bigger by many orders of magnitude. When we saw the upper city of Hammam for the first time, when we drove up to it, it really floored us. It made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And when we walked up on the top for the first time, oh my. When we stood on the top, there was no doubt from that moment to now in my mind that that city was there specifically for a reason. If this isn't Sodom, it's certainly got to be the top of the list as a candidate.
But to convince the archaeological establishment, Collins now needs hard evidence. He has to dig. In the summer of 2005, Jordan's Department of Antiquities approves Collins's proposal to excavate the site. And on the 27th of December 2005, the explorer breaks ground at Tal El Hammam. As years of excavation pass, the team begins to unearth Bronze Age streets, houses, and walls, and a picture of this once great metropolis begins to emerge. It becomes clear that they are dealing with a site far larger than any of them expected. They need someone to map out the entire excavation. They need an archaeological architect.
I didn't think of anybody else. First person I thought of to be able to handle the architectural end of it was Lane Rittmeyer.
Dr. Lane Rittmeyer is one of the world's foremost archaeological architects.
I believe it was in 2003, I got a phone call saying, "Do you want to come and help me? I've discovered Sodom." I said, "Well, you must be mad. It's impossible to find Sodom." It even says in the Bible it's an example of eternal fire, so forget about it.
I did have to really work at convincing him about the Sodom connection, because he wasn't on board to start with.
The destruction is so often referred to in the scriptures as a complete and total destruction that I never thought about the possibility of ever being able to find the remains of those cities.
Knowing Lane, he probably said something like, "Be careful, don't jump to conclusions."
But curiosity eventually gets the better of the archaeological architect.
But I was just intrigued more than anything else. So I was quite willing to set aside my own traditional or biased ideas about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and go out and explore new territory, as it were.
In January 2010, Dr. Rittmeyer arrives at Tal al-Hammam.
Coming to the site itself, we walked around. It took about 3 hours to walk around the site, looking at all the details.
On visiting the site, Dr. Rittmeyer is convinced Collins is onto something.
The sheer size of the city was totally unexpected. This kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, so right here, yeah.
Larger than most ancient sites in the land of Israel. It came to the impression that this must be a very important site.
But the key question on Rittmeyer's mind is, which biblical site could it be? If Tal al-Hammam is Sodom, the Bible provides clues as to what the explorers should find there.
What does the text say about the city? What does it say about what should be there if you found it and excavated it? What kinds of things might you find?
In the book of Genesis, 2 angels are sent by God to carry out the destruction of Sodom. They come to the city disguised as humans, where they are greeted by Abraham's nephew, Lot, who is sat at the gateway to the city.
In Genesis 19, we read that Lot sat in the gate. That means that there was a major gateway, as there usually was.
From the Bible, it's clear that Sodom was a fortified city. It had a monumental gateway, and therefore it must have had city walls.
Dealing with the possibility that Hammam might be Sodom automatically, in my mind, brought up a list of what I want to find. Realistically, the thing that popped up to the top of the list was the gate. Lot sat in the gateway of Sodom. Not many archaeologists have been able to lay their trowels on some architectural feature specifically mentioned in the Bible.
The archaeological architect gets to work. To find the gate, he traces the city's perimeter.
We started off excavating a section of the city wall, and we tried to follow the walls to see if we can find anything else but the wall.
Eventually, they discover a mud brick wall jutting out of the city wall. At first, they believe they've discovered the remains of a single massive tower.
And then I was looking a bit further on, about 12 meters further to the east, and I saw there also bricks coming out from the city wall and a lot of ash. So I asked them to excavate there. And they found another wall coming out from the city wall, which also was about 4 meters wide.
This was far too big to be a single tower.
Regular towers don't stick out more than 2 or 3 meters from the city wall, but this is 16 meters. And that gave me already the idea that we must have here a tower that was flanking a very important point in the city fortification, which could only be then a city gate.
Exactly where Dr. Rittmeyer had predicted. 2 weeks later, the team unearthed the monumental gateway to the city.
The gateway was, first of all, very exciting to find, because when we found the opening in the gateway, we got a very triumphal picture of Steve and myself standing there. We found the gate. It was his major objective, because it's mentioned in the Bible, Genesis 19 verse 1, and Lot sat in the gate. So to find that was absolutely fantastic.
Excellent. Lane said, after we had cleared enough of it away to make it obvious, he said, invite all the whole team and I'll give them a lecture on the gate. And so here's the world's greatest architectural reconstruction architect, talking about the gateway of Sodom to a bunch of excavators and basically saying, you know, welcome to the city of Sodom, here's the gate. All of a sudden I realized the whole inside of my glasses are wet. It's like the tears just like spurted out on the inside of my glasses. It was like I'm hearing confirmation of what I have wanted to find all along. And that was really a moment.
Collins has ticked off the gateway he was looking for. The physical evidence is piling up. The geography, chronology, and architecture all suggest that Tal el-Hammam is the legendary Sodom of the Bible. But to clinch it, Collins must also show that Tal el-Hammam came to the same end as the cities of the plain. In an apocalyptic cataclysm of fire and brimstone. At Tal el-Hammam, Collins and his team soon find evidence of a city swept away by a fiery destruction.
There are cobbles, stones about this size, in that ash matrix that are burned so hot that they are turned into big chunks of chalk. Mud bricks fired so hard that they're like pottery. They become permanent.
But the archaeology reveals more than just a city destroyed by fire. Entire buildings have seemingly been swept away.
We now know the southwestern part of the city was blown off its foundations. That's what the archaeology tells us.
It's a good start, but hardly proof. Other biblical cities, such as Jericho, were also destroyed by a fire. But in January 2011, the team discovers evidence that this destruction was different. Remains of skeletons showing visible signs of a sudden trauma.
Digging down, we found a meter-thick layer of ash. In the lower city also, with skeletons, not buried, they were laying there in all sorts of positions.
Off the charts unusual. Not in a burial position. Limbs twisted, I mean radically twisted. Totally out of joint. In some cases, toes ripped back in the wrong direction.
Those people were instantly incinerated and they fell down with their arms and legs crossed and bones broken. I worked on many sites. I'd never seen a destruction so powerful as this one.
In one case, a child skeleton just mashed on a stone. That's in the ash. That's not a burial. That looks like the back. That's a traumatic crushing of an infant. All the cities on the eastern Kikar have crashed and burned, and that civilization is snuffed out, and nobody lives there for the next 700 years. Now that deserves attention.
For Collins, there is a clue to what happened in the biblical text. It's there in black and white. The Bible says the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire.
The explanation of how Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed takes place in cosmic terminology. It speaks of fire raining down from the sky and destroying these cities. This is obviously meant to be something supernatural, something only a deity could cause, and something of frightening proportions.
According to the Bible, the morning following Sodom's destruction, Abraham looks down across the plain of the Jordan and sees smoke rising from land, like smoke from a furnace. A popular theory is that an earthquake triggered the disaster, but Collins rules it out.
The Bible does not say the ground cracked open and fire came out of the ground and swallowed up the cities. That's not what the text says. If the writer wanted to describe an event of geological dimension, he has all the vocabulary to describe the ground cracking open. Earthquakes, there's lots of earthquakes in the Bible. He can say earthquakes.
The Old Testament tells of a burning matrix that fell from out of the heavens.
So we talk about fire from heaven and brimstone. Now, brimstone is an old English word for burning stones. Well, how can you get burning stones coming from on top mixed with fire?
It's pure and simple in the text, 100% unequivocally, a cosmic originated event. It comes out of the sky, out of the heavens, not out of the ground.
For Collins, a comet or asteroid would be the simplest explanation for the destruction of Sodom and the cities of the plain. But an ancient meteor strike would have left a huge crater in the region, and none have ever been found. The meteor theory, like the earthquake, seems destined to the ash heap of history. But later in 2011, Collins and his team make a discovery that brings the cosmic theory right back into contention. They are carefully brushing away the ash heap of Hammam when they find an extremely unusual 4,000-year-old potsherd.
We hit the ash layer of the Middle Bronze destruction, and it was as hard as rocks, dark, gray, lots of debris torn up into it. So we're troweling through, and I looked down, and I saw this greenish glass glaring up at me. And I picked it up and I flipped it over. You could see the wheeling lines, the clay body itself, the composition was right, everything was right. And immediately I went, it's Middle Bronze Age.
But the problem for Collins is the potsherd looks glazed on one side. And glazed pottery wasn't invented until the 1st century BC, over 1,000 years after Tal el-Hammam's destruction.
I'm thinking, this is weird. Okay, this goes in the bucket.
The translucent greenish glass intrigues Collins, so he sends it to a lab in New Mexico for analysis. The scientists recognize it immediately. The translucent glass is in fact a mineral called trinitite. Trinitite was first discovered in 1945 on the desert floor of New Mexico, in the aftermath of a watershed in modern history, the first ever nuclear bomb test.
The surface of that pottery is physically, chemically, materially identical to trinitite, the melted surface of the sandy ground at ground zero of the explosion of the first atomic bomb.
It dawns on Collins that the trinitite discovered at Tal el-Hammam could only have formed if the pottery was subjected to extremely high temperatures, which would have caused the silicon within the clay to melt and fuse.
The interior of the pottery went up to almost 4,000 degrees, but ended quickly. Why do we know quickly? Because the whole thing would have melted.
One melted pottery sherd does not make an atomic blast. So Collins and his team begin to search for any similar remains. Soon they discover the place is full of it.
We found desert glass in the area, which is where if you have sand, actual just sand, it's melted into globs of glass.
Heat from a normal fire or furnace could not produce such desert glass. It can only be formed when the silica in sand is subjected to extremely high temperatures.
We found pieces of that kind of glass, impact glass, in the area of the Kikar around Tal el-Hammam. So where does this come from?
Collins knows that the most obvious suspect is a comet or asteroid. But the absence of a crater rules it out. However, one day, Collins realizes there's another heavenly possibility.
I was walking across the living room, the TV was on, and lo and behold, there was a documentary on asteroids.
The documentary is about an extremely rare cosmic phenomenon called an airburst. The most famous and studied airburst event in modern history occurred in a remote part of Siberia called Tunguska. In 1908, 2,000 square kilometers of dense forest were incinerated in an instant.
Tree damage is consistent with an energy released by the airburst that would be equivalent to 5 to 15 megatons of TNT, which is an equivalent energy to a very large nuclear weapon, almost the largest nuclear weapon that was ever tested.
An airburst occurs when a comet or asteroid disintegrates before impact, leaving no crater.
After the point that the asteroid fragments, its surface area increases, the drag force goes up, and it decelerates very dramatically. And it's during that period that the immense kinetic energy of the asteroid is transferred to the atmosphere as a blast wave and as a thermal pulse of heat.
What in fact strikes the Earth is a blast wave and the flash of superheated plasma which vaporizes the landscape and creates a distinct plume of smoke, dust, and debris. The result is a mushroom cloud, many times larger than a nuclear detonation and visible for hundreds of miles.
I'm looking at that and I had to sit down and watch it, and I'm going, oh my goodness. That's exactly what Abraham saw.
For Stephen Collins, what Abraham witnessed the morning after Sodom's destruction was in fact the aftermath of an airburst event.
So what we have, I think, in the text is a phenomenological description of the end result of an airburst seen from a distance, a good distance.
It's a radical theory, but Collins believes the pottery sherds at Tal el-Hammam confirm it. They were translucent on one side only.
Extreme heat on one side of an object and not on the other is consistent with a sort of very intense burst of heat from one particular direction that's quite short-lived, which is what would happen in an airburst.
So you have a flash heat that melts the surface, heats up the interior, but the heat goes away almost as quickly as it came. So high heat, quick cool, that's an airburst.
It's always struck Collins that Sodom was the scene of a perfect crime. Total destruction, but no evidence of the killer. Suddenly, an airburst fits the bill. In its wake, it would have left little or no physical evidence it was ever there.
It just rips everything. It's churning, it's ripping, it's sucking everything back out into this plume of debris. And so very little is going to remain.
Two decades after first setting off on his quest, Collins is confident he's cracked the mystery of Sodom. But he's still to convince others. The stumbling block is the dates. Collins dates the destruction of Sodom to 1650 to 1600 BC. But according to some biblical chronologies, that's 3 centuries after Abraham's death. For those who take the Bible story literally, that means there's no way he could have been a witness to Sodom's destruction.
The only problem for some scholars is the chronology. That's what stumps people. They put Abraham way back in the 21st century BC. This is the old Bishop Ussher chronology, where Abraham literally lived to be 175 years and Isaac 180 years, and you string all these dates together and you come up with these long periods and early time frames. The problem is that those numbers are not meant to communicate literal lifespans. They are formulaic, possibly even symbolic numbers.
But for Dr. Collins, everything about Tal el-Hammam matches the biblical narrative.
For locating Sodom and identifying biblical Sodom, that really boils down to 3 things. Right place, right time, and then right stuff. We took that geography, we put it to the test. We confirmed that the cities were exactly where they should be, in exactly the time frame where they should be, and they were destroyed in a manner commensurate with the biblical text.
Although his theory is not yet accepted by the majority, Collins is no longer alone in his quest.
I'm a very cautious person, and I told you I had my reservations about the identification of Tal el-Hammam with Sodom. It took me a few years, but I'm totally convinced that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom. The first time I said it aloud.
Today, Dr. Collins still heads up the excavation at the city he believes was annihilated by fire and brimstone, just as the Bible says.
Even if the story of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't exist, if we had no biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we'd still be talking about an airburst, a cosmic airburst exploding over the Kikar and taking out this civilization. Because the science shows us that's probably what happened. And within time, I think it'll be confirmed.